for this webinar. Tom and I also go back a long way, 18 years in fact.
Okay, when did you do that?
He was an intern at HSBC and I was working there too. And I've watched Tom's career over the years with a lot of interest as he's become a really talented coach and facilitator. And I'm really delighted to introduce him because he's the guy who's going to run us through this particular webinar, Changing Times Means Changing Minds. But before we get into that, just a couple of practical things. The first thing just to say to you is that this webinar is being recorded. So if that is an issue for anyone who's currently on, now is your time to exit the webinar. Tom's going to speak for about 50 minutes or so, and in that time he's got about 3 chapters that he's going to cover. But as you've probably already gathered, those of you who were on the call earlier, a little early, it's going to be quite a fluid webinar. It's not going to be probably our typical one where you get a formal Q&A at the end of a lengthy presentation. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Tom because him and Julia Davis, who is also dialed in, they're going to make sure that it happens all seamlessly. Please use the chat facility if you need to get any messages, because both of them will be checking that on a regular basis. So without further ado, Tom, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Keith, for that really kind introduction. It's great to be here, and it's a fantastic opportunity to get this group of people together to really share some ideas. That's how we're going to approach this, is look at some insights that we've had, some observations that we've made from working with clients, big and small, across lots of different phases, particularly over the last 12 months, and really share some ideas of what this may look like in the future over the next 12 months in the learning space, but also in all kinds of talent development, HR regard, because changing times means changing minds. This actually came out of a phrase that a friend of mine used when he talked about exceptional thinking. And let's face it, we have been through exceptional times. And I want to just make some suggestions and some observations, like I say, about what we've seen during the process of working with clients, and really share some of those to help you to support yourselves and your teams and your organizations as you look ahead into 2021. That's really my intention. And I come at this very humbly, actually, because, you know, I think there's this idea that, you know, we're all in unique situations, and any claim on having the answer, I think has always got to be judged with some real critical analysis, because the answer is only appropriate for the question that you're asking. And so this is definitely coming at it from, you know, with this group of people, you have a huge amount of experience. And so with that in mind, I do want to, I'll get into how to share your ideas and experiences, because I think one of the main reasons why people get together on these things is to hear from other people. But I do want to start, and one of the ways that I'm going to start is by making a conclusion first, which is just a little prediction about where we think the next paradigm of work may be moving. And I'll summarize this by saying, if 2020 has been about resilience and about adapting to the crisis and pivoting and responding in the way that people have in an amazing way, then 2021 is going to be more about these 4 areas: dealing with the uncertainty that's coming, understanding the complexity of the situations that we find ourselves in now, both organizationally, but personally, and all aspects of the way that we operate, and operating with optimism. I'm going to say more about this later on, but this isn't just kind of dreamy, positive thinking. This is really grounded and specific optimism, and how we can use the strength and the sources of strength that we've built up, and then also continuing to integrate diverse ideas, diverse thoughts, and diverse people into this process, so that everyone feels brought along. And I mean everyone. And it's a significant thing throughout the last 12 months, but also into the future. Context. And it's quite brave to put that, what I think is going to be the predictable things that we can look at over the next 12 months. But let me say more just before I get into how I'm going to talk about that. Who's here? We've got Nick Smallman, who is the CEO and founder of Working Voices, and I'm going to bring Nick in later on to his ideas and thoughts on some of the things that we think might be coming down the track. And Julia is producing, and I'll just say a bit about the producer role, because it's such an important role. And all of our virtual sessions that we run as an organization always have a producer, because Julia's really here to hold the space, to allow me to speak and to run the slides, but it means that she's monitoring all of the chat and also letting all the people in, which is great. Julia, I don't know if you want to say anything.
Yes, I'd love to say hello. I've met some of you before, and welcome to those who are joining for the first time. Please, if you've got any questions or comments, pop them into chat, and I'll make sure either that we get Tom answering them immediately, or we'll save them up for the Q&A, or maybe I'll even answer them in the chat. So please make free and frequent use of the chat function. Thank you.
Brilliant. And with that in mind, I'm going to suggest a couple of things straight away that you do that will really help you enjoy this. Number one is, and I suggest this on all of the workshops that I'm running over Zoom, you can switch off your self view. And I really urge you to do this. And you do it by hovering over your picture, and you'll see 3 dots in the corner, and you can click down the menu and just hide self view. It's so useful because most people spend all of their time on things like this, watching themselves and seeing how they look when they're listening, or when they turn their head this way or that way. So it's a wild distraction to have this kind of mirror looking at yourself. So I urge you to hide your self view. The second thing is, as Julia said, just keep adding ideas and experiences and your thoughts, not just in response to what I'm saying, but just sharing with the community. And then thirdly, I urge you to kind of listen to the similarities of what I'm talking about rather than the differences. I completely acknowledge that you've all got different experience and different expertise, huge amount of expertise. So it's listen for what resonates and how it can be useful, rather than whether or not you agree or disagree. And the final person is, there's a funny picture of me with very hair, but the reason why I put that up is, of my role at Working Voices is to head up this kind of learning intelligence unit. And learning intelligence, we actually started a couple of years ago to look at the trends and the themes that are happening in the learning space. And it was very useful because, of course, at that time, we were immediately drawn to virtual learning and also the possibility of remote working. So it meant that we were ever so slightly ahead of the curve when everyone was kind of forced into this remote working and virtual learning. So we've gone from 97% face-to-face delivery into 100% virtual delivery within the space of a few weeks. And I think a lot of you have been in that kind of situation. A lot of people out there have been in that situation. So I want to talk about how we've seen that and what are some of the consistent themes that we've seen from listening to the people who've participated in our training, but also the underpinning ideas of how people have adapted and adjusted to those situations. And I think that will give you some really good information, as well as then some lessons from that and where it may go as we shift into a slightly more hybrid working environment, whatever that may look like. And also then I'll hazard a guess at where I think the learning sphere may be going, and some things to consider, and then we'll open it up for discussion. So that sets the scene. I want to ask if anyone's got any questions at that point, but anything coming in, Julia, or everyone's happy? How many do we have at this point?
Everyone's very happy. And it's, I think, a question of us forging ahead.
Very good. Well, let's look at some of the consistent themes. So this is some of the outcomes that have been achieved through the training. And this is an observation of a list of observations that we've made of people and what they've found useful during this time. And I'm just going to highlight 2 or 3 things from this list. So I'll let you read that list. First on the list is virtual presence. Of course, as soon as everyone went into a virtual platform, there was a lot of anxiety about how do I come across on video? How do I come across when I'm in my own space, own environment, but still need to have impact or communicate well or present well or have a voice in a meeting? And so that's been a huge focus, and I think it will continue. The second thing that I'll focus on is this worker-centric structure and boundaries, because when work came into the home, what it meant is people had to be able to set boundaries for themselves, not only physically, as in furniture and rooms, but also emotionally and psychologically. And you'll notice that I've said worker-centric structure, because I believe now we do work in a worker-centric structure from home in a remote environment, because offices were very work-centric structures. And I think the shift, both psychologically and emotionally, is much more into a worker-centric way of operating and engaging. And that has ramifications for the way that people are managed and the way that they learn and the way that they move through their careers. The third thing that I'll highlight is this handling upset and uncertainty. And all of us will realize that there's been a huge amount of physical and very real trauma, and trauma with a little t, happening to people as they've adjusted. And it's meant that it's brought right to the front of the stage the need for people to be acknowledged for being human and for being the way that they are in their circumstances, and that those circumstances are unique and are really important for how they operate at work. So if anything, you know, the early part of this year, of last year was no matter what session I was running, people, no matter what the title was, people just wanted to hear from other people and to tell their story. And I think part of that was processing the anxiety that they were experiencing. And so it's led to this adaptability. Now, some of the seeking additional training, so this is what people are still looking for, and still some of the gaps. The first and the last thing on this list, so influencing without authority and managing up, I think is most significant, which is people, although they want to develop virtual presence across all these platforms, it's how do they have influence with people beside them, around them, above them, so that they feel part of the conversation and part of decisions, and being able to have that upward influence into organizations. And I'm going to say more about that and how organizations can work with that culture. And then this safe and consequence-free environment. There's been a lot talked about recently about psychological safety, and I think this is brilliant, because this is a really, really part of how operating in their organizations. And you know, if you're interested, there's a brilliant podcast by Amy Edmondson. Also, her book The Fearless Organization is outstanding on this. And I wanted to get a bit more in depth on what psychological safety means, because this underpins a lot of the work that we've been doing. And I wanted to do a bit of a information kind of output for you. And I'm actually just going to be quiet while you may take in and just read that slide on how people may adapt to the situation that they've experienced. So I'll just be quiet, you read that. Now this is adapted from the Kubler-Ross, David Kessler stages of grief curve, or stages of change curve. And you know, start with of panic, confusion, bit of disorganization, then down into some fairly difficult emotions about kind of guilt and isolation, and then can be depression, but and then lifting up into new shoots, new patterns, new strengths, and then eventual adjustment and hope and change as people move. And we've adapted that model to apply to this, and how people have adapted. So actually, Julia's going to raise the first poll of this event, and it's the thing about a poll, the brilliant thing about it is it's completely anonymous, and there it is. And the question is, having looked at that, and by the way, if you want to move that so that you can see each phase, you can just lift it title of the box. But I just want you to reflect on where you think you are now while people are doing that. And it's great to see not everyone's in phase 6. I think people leap to being in phase 6 because it feels like, yeah, I've got through this. I'm in an optimistic place right now. But I think people are all over the place in reality on this, and that actually there's a lot more people going throughout the phases because it's not just a linear thing. And I'll say more about that in a moment.
Well, the clock's ticking away here, or counting down.
Yeah.
But most people have filled it in. I think I'm definitely in 4 at the moment.
That's interesting. Well, it's great. It's great information for people to know. Everyone's in the phase 3, 4, 5, or 6. And I'm actually going to move into what people need at each phase, because I think this is where it's been really useful to us. So there we have the answers or the responses to this. Very interesting to see the spread. I'm going to say one thing before we move on to what people need at this phase. I'm going to close that down. There we go. Of course, there is a massive kind of desire to want to be up the phases to phase 5 or 6, and that's completely legitimate. And certainly businesses want people to move quickly to adjust. And this whole idea of resilience is your ability to bounce back or to respond to changes and adapt quickly. But I'll just give this warning that actually that can be quite dangerous, and I'll say why. In the grief cycle and the way that people do move through change, there is a sense of loss and hurt, and that sounds more significant than it is. It's just that there's a kind of movement from the old world, and in order to get people happy, they actually do need to feel comfortable to go through and navigate each phase and be given time and acknowledgement in each phase to be able to approach the emotions at each phase so that they emerge more psychologically robust on the other side. And that's really important, because actually where you build resilience is by going into sometimes the dark places to then be able to adjust fully and not be or brittle as you come into the hope or change. You'll notice there's a part under phase 3 which is a phony adjustment, and I made that reference to the kind of phony war during the Second World War, which is people knew that they were at war but there was no real fighting, which is you feel like you've made an adjustment and it's okay, but actually you haven't made the real kind of, geez, this is changing everything kind of adjustment. So let's look ahead at what people need from each other during each phases. And I am going to go through each of these things because I think that there are certainly some interesting things that I want to say for the first 3 phases of some ideas that I think are really helpful. And at the first shock phase, reassurance and empathy and truth is what people tend to need. Now, this is paradoxical. And I've been talking with leaders about there's a massive human kind of response to people in shock or in anger that they need kind of comforting. And we saw this with world leaders, and we've seen this in lots of organizations where people have said, don't worry, it's all okay, it's handled, or we're on top of it. But in fact, the reason why that messaging is dangerous is because then it dumbs people down to the reality of what's going on. So I've been suggesting all along that actually what people do, instead of saying it's okay, we've got it handled, but much more to say, this is what we know and this is what we don't know. Or this is what we're doing and this is what we're not doing. Because that's truthful, and then people can make up their own minds about what they need to worry about. So that it's really important in that kind of paradox or tension between being supportive and reassuring, but also being truthful and honest. Now, as people come through that, they do get curious and kind of, this is a new situation, this is different, this is a bit exciting, even though it might be challenging. And people need guidance and direction at this point, and still regular check-ins. And as like humans are amazingly adaptable. So we saw this all throughout last year, which is the capacity that people have is remarkable for being able to adopt new rhythms. But I will say this about businesses as well, which is we're really good at, or we have been really good at managing to longer term goals like 6-month or annual targets. But when new rhythms are around and anxiety and uncertainty and unpredictability are there, it's quite useful to be able to shorten the range that people have to work towards. So giving people kind of goals of what you need to focus on this week, what I need you to focus on this month, is much more valuable at this time of new rhythms. So boundaries and timelines become more important. Then, like people are adaptable, they're also amazingly quick to deal with new rhythms, and then they become habitual or a bit kind of drudgery, or a bit like the grind kicks in again. So it used to be that working from home was kind of exciting, and now it's like, no, now I've just got the office in my house, which is, oh God, this again. And so the two at the bottom of this list is really nice, which is how people create meaning for each other in what they're doing. And also novelty. When I mention novelty, people are like, oh, I haven't thought of that, which is basically as soon as something becomes dull, it's a really good idea to add a bit of freshness. Now, I don't mean changing it up just for the sake of it, because that's just irritating. But what I do think is novelty means introducing some freshness. So while human beings love stability, some more than others, also we love variety. So it's getting that balance right between stability and variety is really a useful distinction to have when you're thinking about learning and interventions, or when you're thinking about leading or managing teams yourselves or organizations. Now the cabin fever kicks in, and this has got some activation to it. So it's not just rainy days, the doldrums. It's actually kind of, oh, I'm getting a bit frustrated with this. Where frustration gets directed at people or at the whole or the people in authority, and this is where people need encouragement and persistence and support in that phase, and then some aspiration at the hope and change, so that we've got a goal to look towards, or some role models or some examples to look towards that keep us going in that direction. Now I'm just going to say two things, because I've gone through that in some detail, and I hope that's useful, and then I'll take a pause. Two things are, I think you can probably see already that it's really important that we understand where other people might be, or that we at least have a way of communicating what kind of things they might be going through. Because as you can imagine, if I'm a naturally kind of, let's say, positive, optimistic, energetic person, and I naturally want to G people up and tell them it's going to be all right and go and get in their faces and tell them to keep going, for someone who's going through a shock phase, that could be really inappropriate or tone deaf. But on the flip side, in the same way, if I'm someone who's naturally a worrier and likes to plan ahead and is quite anxious, I don't want to then voice that with someone who might be in the restlessness, frustrated phase, because then that's just going to be irritating as well. So I think that what this does beautifully is it starts to articulate that increased level of sensitivity. A lot's being talked about empathy for sure, and that's great. But this is kind of directed empathy, which is, am I dealing with the people in the phases that they're in and responding in the way that they need, rather than just my natural way? The second thing that I'll say is, and this is, the skills. These are things that people can learn and can get better at through practice. And the way that resilience is developed is not necessarily through attending a resilience course, although that's really powerful, but it's actually, they get resilience from the people around them, giving them what they need at the time that they need it. So can develop cultures and teams that have this awareness, then people are giving resilience to each other in a kind of friction kind of way, which is the energy that gets given off as the molecules buzz around an organization in a good way. You see my analogy there.
We've had
so with
had
that,
a question about
do we
resilience.
take a pause and just see what's coming in?
So we've had a question about resilience, actually, really to define it a little bit, because there's also a bit of a sense of, can it mean denial or even desensitization? So what do we mean by resilience effectively?
Okay.
And in my sense, I suppose it's the ability to bounce back.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to explain it in 3 ways, just to be really clear. And I think your point about denial is a great one, which is we've thought about this idea because resilience has definitely been an important factor in this. But we want to be also careful of not thinking of resilience as just being a better punch bag. And actually, if you can invert that idea of resilience as actually maybe resilience isn't the problem. The problem is, why is it that people keep putting stress on each other and aren't kind to each other in work or in families or in different situations? So actually, by inverting the idea of resilience, you actually might be getting to the root problem, which is not just how do I be better at taking the blows, but more like how do we not give blows to one another? And I think that's a really good example of just like thinking about resilience in a different way, rather than just how do I, take the bad news with the good news. The 2 other ways that I'll explain resilience is resilience. Absolutely, Julia, is that bounce back ability, which is how do you respond and even flourish. And the irony of saying, how do I flourish when there's a setback? Well, it's not just recovering, but also thinking, how is this an opportunity? And again, this is bounded optimism, but it's not just saying, oh, the roof's fallen in, where's the silver lining? Because that could be denial or false thinking. What's much more important in that kind of resilience is the roof's fallen in, what led to that happening? And then what can I learn from that situation that I can draw into my day-to-day? The second way of thinking about resilience is also grit. And Angela Duckworth wrote beautifully about grit in her book called Grit, which is that even though the day-to-day stuff might be battering and buffeting, it's also really important that you've got your eye on a bigger prize, that you're able to get through the day-to-day, even though it's not beautiful each day, that you've got an eye on what you want to achieve. So that's a long way of describing resilience, the way I see it.
I get knocked down, but I get up again. We've also got that one. Love that.
Lovely, beautiful, exactly. And I mean, we've been running a session on maintaining motivation, and one of the key tenets of maintaining motivation is accepting that there are going to be setbacks, accepting that there are going to be days when you don't feel motivated. That's part of being motivated. That's part of the process. And if I can give another analogy, just like physical fitness might be to do with strength, it might be to do with power, it might be to do with endurance. Emotional fitness is to do with not just can you handle good emotions when they come, but also can you handle bad emotions when they come? Because they will, and they do, and they're
yeah, it's coping with all of it, isn't it?
Any other things coming through?
Yeah, I think it'd be great to hear what have people learned over the last year. What's really worked for them in terms of maintaining their resilience, and how have they put that into effect? I've worked very hard myself at not being too weather dependent. So trying very hard to enjoy walking in the rain as much as I do walking in the sun. And wine, Keith, is essential.
Very good. Very good. Absolutely. So being able to use your own strengths of what's important and knowing what in your environment will support you. So let's look at some of the ways in which what we've observed, if that's all right, if I keep going, if everyone's happy. Yeah, we're
Yes.
doing good for time. One thing that we've seen as a resounding theme throughout a lot of the work that we've done is employees report and reflect that they want to be self-determining. And self-determining means being kind of in control and taking action. And that is particularly interesting because when there's anxiety and uncertainty around, it's really good to provide a way in which people can take action. And I think that learning, development, talent is a really good responsible area where that can be focused, and actually people can focus on it. Even though there's been a bit of cliche about, like, you know, lockdown 3, you know, what skills are you learning and what progress are you making? I think that's exactly this. This is people want to be taking action when there's problems happening, and feel like they're effective in what they do. And particularly with the John Burson talks about this idea of power skills, and power not in the sense of manipulation, but power as in what gives you power, which is that of influence and self-leadership, which I'm going to come on to in a little while, but and communication. So the ability to have your voice heard is really powerful in self-determining. One other shift that we've seen in learning activities is that they need to be useful for people's immediate pain right now. And this is also known as learning in the flow of work. And what that means is, you know, it probably used to be okay for learning to be like something, and you have some ideas or some models knocking around in the back of your mind. But actually now it's much more that, you know, people want to be learning in the flow of work, which is they come up against an obstacle and then they want to tackle that obstacle. So they need to go and find a learning opportunity or a thing that's going to educate them in the skill that they need to overcome that problem right now, so that they can then continue and keep making progress. And I think that's a really good kind of signpost to the fact that as a community, we can all move towards kind of that rapid, adaptable learning intervention that isn't too stuck in what we have to do or the status quo, but actually is really responsive to people, and rather than being too draconian about what people need to do. So I think these are 3 really interesting lessons that we've observed, and also what that has meant about the shift to virtual. So the shift to virtual has been, and I'm going to bring all of these up, this crisis of last year, and I talk about a crisis as in, you know, there are many layers to it, whether it's the economic or the directly medical in the pandemic, or the lockdown measures, or the different, so there's huge amounts of crises, layers that might be happening. But it's increased this focus on upskilling and giving people the reason and the focus to be able to upskill themselves, but also reskill in the way that their jobs might be moving or changing, or direction maybe going. Manager capability has come under the spotlight, and it always has been, because manager capability, and I'm going to make this distinction, which is I think quite useful. I think it used to be related to as a generalist skill. It was something that people acquired through experience, through trial and error, and it was something that was, you know, if you're a good at kind of everything about soft skills, then that made you a good manager. Whereas I definitely see manager capability now as a specialist skill, as something that can be developed and honed, and is therefore used and utilized in the right way, which is people are capable in that format to be able to do what they need to do. There's also, in the shift to virtual and remote working, there's been this realization, and it's brilliant because it's a beautiful recognition. And I think we as a community have been, in an HR capacity, have been knowing that people are more than just their output for a long, long time, but it's really come to the front now, which is we are more than just our output. We are more than just the tasks we achieve. And it came to me over a period during April and May, which is, you know, a lot of people, it's not that they're not capable at their jobs, and their ability to perform isn't given by their competence or their keenness or enthusiasm. It's actually given by their circumstances and their situation that they're in is a massive factor in how they can, whether or not they can do their job. And so taking that into consideration is well worth it. And that's why mental health has been such a big focus over the last few years, which is rightly so. And we've got to find a way, and I say we, but like everyone, to support people to be able to move away from this idea that managing their emails and the meetings overload is doing their job. Now, this was a problem before the pandemic, for sure, but it's become even more exacerbated and even more intense, I think, as remote working's taken over. But and it is getting people into this mindset, not just that emails will choke you up if they're left into chaos, but also this mindset that I am more than just me managing my emails, and I am more than my capability to be able to manage meetings. And it's not just be better at prioritizing, it's actually getting people into the attitude of I've got to be doing high value activities that add something to my enterprise. And maybe having my inbox at 0 isn't it, because there's lots of, it might be it, but there's probably a lot more that I could be doing to be useful to my organization than just managing my emails well. So those are 3 things that people have really struggled with, and I think it's something that we can support them with. Also, this talks to a little bit about culture, and the crisis has increased the need for culture. We've seen organizations that where autonomy and trust was already instilled as part of their culture, they adapted well, they pivoted well, and they moved remote quite easily. Whereas places where the culture wasn't trusting and wasn't autonomous and didn't give people empowerment, they struggled. And there's a reason for that, because often culture is, and those of you who are studying it, and I'm sure a lot of you are into this, so I just love this way of thinking about it, and it's really simple, which is, we want culture to be based on achieving tasks and getting things done, and like I say, adding high value to our enterprise. We hope that it's also about people and support and purpose, maybe some values, but in reality, it's often about power and control. And maintaining status, and I'll say more about this in a moment. But so getting, this is the level of kind of denial sometimes, which is really tackling what is our culture and how do we want it to be and what's it like. Because let's face it, the office environment wasn't perfect. So as we look about the shift, there was a if we're really honest, there was a favoring of dominant characteristics and characters and traits that did, win the day or get their views heard because of their personality rather than the right kinds of reasons. There was a lot of implicit communication. That's great. And it's what people are missing to some extent, which is implicit, meaning it's not said and it's not written, but it's kind of assumed, or it's kind of there. And there's a lot of that kind of social conformity and maintaining status in an office environment, which can be helpful and it can be useful when it's positive, but it also can be destructive. So the shift to virtual has meant that a lot of that has been wiped clean, hopefully, and for good or for ill, it means that some of the focus, I think, is going to be on developing strength in all characteristics, in all ways of being, including all people, and including all of their wonderful quirks and idiosyncrasies and differences. So developing that capability in everyone. And it depends on really explicit open communication as opposed to implicit. Now, I've been talking about this on sessions for a little while, and we've been doing a lot of work on this, which is explicit means people haven't developed the muscles or the skills to be able to ask for what they need when they need it, or the support that they might want. I mean, I've spent a couple of sessions just focused on 3 questions, which is, how do I reach you, and how does the team reach you? What support do you need? And what do we do when we deal with raised emotions? And just those 3 questions for a team to discuss and find answers to, because they've never discussed it before. So this is being explicit about what used to be implicit. And it's a really good basis to look at. Also, as I've said, you know, the ways that people might work, and now work and home being more interpenetrated, means that people have to be making good decisions, executing good judgment about what the right inputs are and what needs to be done. And this all develops this self-leadership. A lot of early interventions has focused on managers, how managers can manage virtual teams and that kind of thing. And I think that's brilliant. But again, we slightly inverted that, which is not just how do managers be more effective, but also how do people be more effective at being managed, and thinking about how they self-lead. So, you know, coping with change, building resilience, having a voice and being heard and speaking up, listening and empathy and understanding different perspectives. These are all acts of self-leadership, which everyone, all talent, can take on. I worry I'm being a little preachy, so maybe I'll be quiet and see if there's any questions or thoughts.
Monica's made a really good observation about, you know, in terms of generational, lots of younger people, particularly around big urban areas, are living in shared accommodation, which isn't always conducive for working or learning environments. So, you know, often a lot of us have been working in bedrooms. You know, there's all sorts of different different stresses upon us, really, or different questions to ask of our flexibility.
Absolutely. Yeah, and you know, the thing I said earlier about worker-centric or work-centric structures. Work-centric structures are really good because it means you can go in, you know, that's work, and then you can extract. And you know that environment is a work-orientated place. And like you say, Julia, like a lot of places that we live in aren't necessarily work-centric, and that is a real, genuine challenge.
And I think it continues and will continue.
Insignificant for people.
Is literally. I think what's changing is absolutely, as you've said, getting to the transaction too quickly. So making sure that we're putting people before the transaction.
Yeah, brilliant. It's that beautiful idea of you know, I think people have been really good at managing tasks and transactions, like you say, and then when they start managing people, the tasks and transactions take care of themselves. And now that's an easy thing for me to say from where I'm at, but you know, that's uniquely challenging for each and every individual who are in their own circumstance. And acknowledging that and equipping managers and leaders and people who work with other people to acknowledge all of those nuances is a real maturity that our community can definitely take on. This really requires being able to look, and actually this is a perfect sentence to kind of sum it up, which is, you know, being able to look uncertainty in the eye and know that we may not know exactly what the outcome might be or what the future may hold, but that we have the strength or the resources that we need to be able to handle what we need to handle now. And that's a really important kind of mindset for people to have now. And that is cultural, and it is in the way people act and the examples and artifacts that and the language that people use around them. Lovely. So I've got a little way to run, a few more minutes, if that's good. And I wanted to share some of the ideas that we think is going to be important about the shift to hybrid, because let's face it, there is a future coming, and no matter what happens, there will hopefully, and I'm actually hesitating saying this because I know that this is dangerous, but either way, there will be a move where to work in shared environments again and collective space again. But before I say that, this quote is really beautiful. So I'm just going to sum it up and quote it directly and read it to you, which is, for those who think and hope that things are basically going to go back to the way that they were, stop. They won't. It's better to accept the reality that the future isn't what it will be, and to start thinking about how to make it work. Now, this isn't to add anything too deep, but I just think this particular McKinsey piece of work, and I'm sure all of you have read some McKinsey because they've produced and published some brilliant work over the last 12 months. But this really summarizes really important mindset to help people. I think there's a real habit of thinking of creating false horizons. And we're seeing that at the governmental level, at all sorts of levels, which is, oh, when the vaccine happens, or when this comes. A colleague of mine calls it destination happiness, which is, when I get there, I'll be happy, or when this happens, or when the weekend comes, or when I'm on holiday, or when I get the vaccine, it'll be all right. We've got to watch out for creating those false horizons with people, and actually realize that it's much better to orientate them towards, how do we make this work, as in what's happening in reality, rather than always looking towards the next good thing. And certainly this hybrid working is going to be challenging. You know, even if I dread to talk about the pandemic or the virus because it's really dangerous territory, but whatever happens with the virus, let's say, hybrid working is going to mean, you know, people might return to offices, they might go into new offices, they might be in different locations, they might be at home and in the office, there might be staggered teams, there might be, and everyone's going to be in a completely unique and variable situation. But if we can instill this mindset into people, then they can look that uncertainty in the eye, as I said, and be able to really attack it in a optimistic way. And supporting people to do that. So these are some themes that we think could be helpful to support people with that. Now, critical thinking and decision making and problem solving. I'll say this about that. It would be very rare that an individual at their year-end review or at their development planning stage at the beginning of the year would say, "Do you know what? I really need to improve my critical thinking." That's unlikely to be something that someone says. And also just as rare is probably that someone's going to say, "I need to make better decisions or solve problems in a better way." Because most of us fall into the confirmation bias of thinking that what we do is right because we look for the evidence that supports the decision that we took. But I think this is definitely where our community can support people with. And that means nudging people and suggesting that actually this is a lot of the way through. So being able to think with higher forms of process and protocols for getting through problems and decisions. And interestingly, critical thinking isn't about intelligence. It's actually nothing to do with intelligence. Critical thinking is, do I have a systematic way of getting through my own thinking to be able to make decisions? And I think this will make a big difference to the way that meetings are run as well. As I've mentioned throughout this, operating with bounded optimism, and Maria is a colleague of mine and ours at Working Voices, is the author of this. And bounded means it's not fanciful, it's not magical or wishful, it's grounded in reality, but it is with full knowledge of the strength and the ability that you have in the bank already, that you can attack situations with. And I think this is going to be really important, that we've got both bounded but also optimistic outlook for this year, and training people with skills and outputs. There are going to be cycles of uncertainty. That is an absolute given, I think, that there are going to be measures and relaxed measures, and there are going to be lockdowns and relaxed lockdowns, and there are going to be differences across regions, and there are going to be differences across industries, and there's going to be these waves of uncertainty and change. So not necessarily dealing with the direct things that may happen, because we might not know exactly what they might be from one month to the next, but equipping people with the mindset of being able to manage cycling and manage the waves of uncertainty that might come will really support them in coping.
One of the things that's
inclusive management.
One of the things that's come up, Tom, is how do you help people to live with uncertainty and ambiguity. In fact, I think it was Michael Moran said that. So what briefly would you say about that in terms of these things?
I love the briefly.
Yeah,
Tom,
I know.
can you just tell me in 10 seconds what we mean?
Yes, just
No, I love it. No, it's really
on the
good.
pinhead.
All right.
I'll let you think about it.
Yeah, no, I'm thinking. Okay. There are two parts of uncertainty that are important to acknowledge. One is unpredictability, and two is the insecurity that raises. When you can deal with the unpredictability of life, then you realize that life was always unpredictable. But it's the insecurity that gets us. And
Right.
it's what it does to us internally that actually is the thing to tackle. So a lot, and a way that I'd answer that in a really pithy way of dealing with it is take an outside view rather than an inside view. And what I mean by that is when we get faced with a unique situation, what we tend to do is take an inside view, which is when's this going to end? How do I get out of it? What do I do, basically? Whereas if you that's a very inside emotion driven way of looking at it. And it's quite hard. So you've got to be quite objective and not brutal, but just an outside view is, when have I faced this in the past that was similar? Or who else has faced something similar that I can lean on or get support from?
Right.
Because taking that outside view allows you to look at what's the insecurity that it's confronting in me.
Thank you.
Brief.
Very good.
Beautiful. And any comeback on that, I'd love to hear it. I'd love to hear some thoughts on that. But yes. I've also I'm committed to getting through these last parts so that we can open it up. Is that cool with everyone? Give me a wave. Yeah, good.
Yeah,
all right, good. Cool. So inclusive management is continuing to manage, including everybody, including all thoughts, all ideas, all opinions, and welcoming and affirming that everyone is has a meaningful contribution to make, is a definite skill. And is not just a natural thing. Managing and motivating remote hybrid teams is going to continue to be a challenge, and we think that that's a learning theme that's really helpful. And then this self-management thing that I've talked about, the self-leadership of being able to take on ourselves and how we're relating to situations. Now, the final thing, and so I've promised this is the home straight, is I also think, and Nick and Working Voice is really good at this, which is we also think that not only is our role to be able to account for what might be some of the themes coming up so that we're ready, and so that you're ready and you're equipped to look at this within your organizations and with your leaders, but also to even look a little bit ahead further. Because I think these are just some suggestions and some ideas to just consider, because we think they're going to emerge as being fairly important. And the context for this is, 6 or 7 years ago, a lot of the focus that we've got now would have seemed unimaginable. So it's important to think, well, what's unimaginable now that we're getting the early indicators for? And some of the 5 themes that we're thinking might emerge and tackling loneliness, not just as a result of isolation, but that need to connect within teams and with gets ever more kind of atomized. Similarly, building trust, and trust is important, but as I've been talking about, the beauty and the strength in telling the truth to ourselves and tackling denial, and really facing up to what's going on, not in a hard way, but in a warm, gentle way. Media literacy is going to become more and more important, and some countries are training their youngsters in how to be able to identify misinformation, what the notions of reality are, and also managing your social media. And I think this is going to become the responsibility of organizations to, and I don't mean what you post on social media, But what I mean is how you let it influence the way that you make meaning out of situations. Because that is going to be, we've seen how divisive it can be, but also we've got to get some control over it. And I think that could become part of a responsibility that we have. Adapting to new norms of identity and the diversity of ideas, and building bridges even with people, and collaborating and working in teams and organizations with people that we may not see the world the same way. So being able to work with lots of different people from different points of view, and that certainly is going to be a learnable thing. And then finally, mental agility. This is actually quite hard to articulate, but it's the ability to use your and working well to be able to recall information quickly, and so that you can make decisions and execute judgment in the right way. I love this, because the antithesis of this is the kind of Google effect, without having to look it up on your phone, because that's slightly dumbing down our intelligence on just what are some of the things that we know in our mind. So look, these are some ideas. They're not carved in stone, and I know it might be like opening a box of frogs that I've released these into the world, but hopefully it's just some stimulation. And I know, Nick Smallman, you'd love to come in and talk about and open up as I finish up.
Thank you very much indeed, Tom. I appreciate that. Thank you for your presentation. This last bit is really about the idea to be prepared. The organization, if you bear in mind just how fast the world changes now. I mean, 10 years ago, social media, etc., was more in its infancy. And now social media dominates our lives. And most importantly, it's the information flow that we have to manage. And all of these 5 themes, the morale, the trust, the media literacy, adapting to new norms, this is all in our economic lives, in our social lives, and most importantly, in our online lives. And because so many of us, I mean, the figures are staggering, how much time we now spend online. And that's going to have ramifications on how we communicate in the workplace. And obviously, Working Voices is a communication consultancy. And our job is to help people to interact with other people successfully. But if you spend a lot of time, especially when you're isolated like now, this has just sped up that process of people being heavily reliant on a screen. So, this next chapter of learning is simply some ideas that we're starting to discuss, and we discuss them because we want to make sure that when clients start really noticing patterns, that we've already thought about what the causes may be and what we can do about it. Anyway, that's all I have to say about that, and we'd very much like to open up now for questions. So Julia, why don't you let us know what people are asking, and please feel free to ask us anything.
Thank you very much indeed. I'd like to, there's been lots of really great contributions, but what I'd love to start off with is with Colette, if you're happy to unmute, and perhaps we could stop the share. What do you think? Stop screen sharing, Tom?
Yeah.
So Colette, where are you? Are you able to unmute?
Hello, hi.
Hi, lovely to see you. Can you tell us a little bit about glorifying mental toughness?
Sure, yeah, I did a management course a few years ago, and one of the units was all about mental toughness, and I really struggled with it because it was it kind of went against some of the things that I think make me a good manager and effective people manager. So I kind of challenged this idea that we should glorify mental toughness and that we should strive to always demonstrate that and always achieve that. because I'm really obsessed with Brené Brown, the American researcher and author who talks about vulnerability and showing vulnerability. And that's why I put my camera on, even though I'm very tired and there's terrible lighting and a double chin. But if you can be vulnerable with the people that you line manage, I think especially last year, it was so powerful to just allow yourself to have those moments on Zoom calls like this, just saying, I've hit a wall today, I'm really struggling. You know, I've sat with managers that I manage in my team and let them have a cry, and just, we were all, you know, the thing that people keep saying about this pandemic is we're all in the same boat. Well, that's not true at all. We're all in different boats, but we're all, you know, in the same sea or in the same ocean. But I think being totally honest, and I really liked Tom's point about saying, this is what we do know, this is what we don't know, this is what we're trying to achieve, or this is what we're trying to avoid, and just being completely transparent, being honest about when you're having a rough time. It just gives other people emotional permission to say the same. And I think last year that was just really powerful for us as a team. And I've just done a round of annual reviews, and a couple of people have said, I'm happier now than I've ever been. And I think in terms of their working life, and I think part of that is the trust and the bond that we developed over the course of last year through having all those vulnerable conversations.
So important. Thank you very much. I know somebody that we were coaching. She says she now starts every meeting with a 2-word check-in of your internal state. Don't necessarily pay attention to it, but at least, you know, you put it front and center. And Michael Moran, you've got lots of very good questions, I think, for Tom.
Thanks, Colette. Really good insight as well.
Yeah. Would you be able to unmute? Hello, Michael.
Yep, I can. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, very well.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Returning to the issue of uncertainty and ambiguity, and I suspect we've grown up in relatively certain times, and we expected our leaders to have the answers and tell us the right questions. Now we're trying to come to terms with leaders who don't know the answers. And I'm not just talking politicians, I'm talking in business as well. And so I do think one of the major challenges is to help people live with this sense of ambiguity. I've always gone down the path of, well, let's control the things you can control and try and influence the things you can. But other than that, don't worry about the outside. But that's very easy to say and do with all the insecurity around furlough, job loss, etc. Is the company going to survive? So if I can push you more, I think it would be helpful as HR professionals is how we can develop this skill around helping people live with ambiguity and uncertainty.
Absolutely right. And Michael, I totally agree with you. And as Colette's beautifully articulated, I think that vulnerability to say, I don't know, but I know, one distinction that I really like is, I don't know that, but I do know this. Or here's what's changing, but here's what's staying the same. So you're getting people comfortable with that there is that tension, and that tension does need to be, held within each and every individual. Because like the not knowing certain things, but then I can deal with what I do know. And that's a repetitive thing. I think you're right. Really, really good point.
And Keith, do you want to unmute? And this is for Nick, really.
Thank you, Michael.
What are we planning for the future, given continued lockdown in this country anyway? Are you still there, Keith? You may have disappeared for a moment. Oh no, there you are. You might be double muted. Hurrah.
I am, or at least I was. Yeah, Nick and Tom, I mean, you started this webinar by saying that a lot of what you were sharing was not just from the clients that you deal with, who were many, but also just from personal experience yourselves, because Working Voices was, and may still become again, an organization that relied on a lot of face-to-face execution, right? That's the nature of what you do. And you had to pivot very quickly to this type of approach. I was just curious, you know, this, I mean, who knows how long this is going to go on for, what the future may have in store, but I'm just curious what other things you might be considering, using your word novelty, Tom, which I like, is going to keep your audiences attached to the work that you do.
That's good.
I'll have a
Nick, why don't you have a crack and
you can finish up. I mean, I think the point is we need to be in constant dialogue with clients. What we've noticed is clients tend to go into their burrows a little bit and have chats with themselves. So there are clients that will say to us, yeah, we're just going to have a meeting and we'll get back to you when we've had our meeting. And 6 months later, they're still having a meeting. I mean, these are large corporates. And of course, the problem is that if you want people to help you, you probably need to invite them into the conversation. So the first thing we'd like to do is really talk to clients. And it's also not just, I mean, Tom talked very eloquently about this idea of what are the pain points now? But actually what clients also need to be doing is having conversations about what do you think is going to happen in the future? I mean, if you look at the city, we do a lot of work in the city with financial organizations. They have whole desks designed to look at the future. You know, futures and all that kind of stuff is trying to predict the future. We should be doing the same in learning. I feel very, very strongly about that. Because if you can do that, you can then start to develop things with clients and really help them to shape things. So by the time the issue comes along, we're ready to go. The real problem for a lot of people when the pandemic hit is we were ready to go, but our clients weren't ready to implement. And so when people needed in that initial shock phase, they still had to go through a lot of bureaucracy to roll out these things. But actually, it's that idea of, they talk about it in economic terms. It's not just in time learning, it's just in case learning. They were talking about, you know, hospital beds. We need a just in case model. So if we do have a pandemic, we're ready and we can, then the society can carry on going. And I think a just in case model for learning is just as important. And the themes that I mentioned very briefly just now about the fact that there is a massive merging of our lives because so much of our lives are on screen. I mean, and we were noticing this before the pandemic. If you look at the statistics for social media use and screen use in general, it's very, very high amongst young people, all those people who are coming into the workforce. It's very, very high in middle-aged people. That's going to have an effect with not only how people want to learn, but the information they're absorbing and then how they talk about it. So we probably also notice things like the silos of how, you know, there are lots of little tribes forming in society. Those tribes may well come into work. Tom's point about being able to accept new norms is vital if people are going to get on with each other, because people talk about stuff other than work. And we need to make sure there is an environment from a communication perspective where people feel it's okay to express their views. Hopefully those views are grounded in knowledge and a certain amount of efficacy. We have a bit of an epistemic problem at the moment. But it's really, to answer your question, it's about getting involved with a client early and designing experiences for our clients that are tailored for them. That's what I would say is important. Tom, I don't know if you have anything else.
Yeah, brilliant, Nick. To build on that as well, I think always when people think about innovation, they think of technology or like new ways of delivering.
Yeah.
If I was X-Space, what I'd be looking at is VR. And like the fact that at the moment we've got Zoom, MS Teams, we've got WebEx, we've got a couple of other FaceTime, we've got, you know, and not just, but just for communicating with video. I think there are lots of people in garages all over the world designing the new experience that people will have of office environments. And it will probably look a little bit like having your iPhone on a headset and you be able to be an avatar in a virtual office space. Now that's how tech may evolve. And I don't know that, but it's just an idea. But I go back to this other idea, which is, I think that the knowledge and experience is already in the teams as they are. It's already in the organizations that you've got. If anything, it's getting people to access that and being able to and engage in good conversations with each other so that they're able to shift from like knowing something to actually implementing it and doing it. And I think that comes through conversations on lots of platforms, whatever. So those are two ways
Yeah,
it might evolve.
I think David Franks had a comment or a question around hybrid and dispersed working. Are you still with us, David?
I am, yes, absolutely.
Oh,
Sorry,
hello.
I'll put the
Brilliant,
camera on as
yeah.
well, even. Yeah, I was reading some stuff earlier, particularly about some, maybe have slightly forward-thinking organisations, but I think applies to everybody about the differences in the office environment between simply the shift of here's what we did before and we're just going to do it remotely, to a very different model of operation around. You use the term hybrid, and then perhaps I missed it. I didn't hear you talk much more about what you meant by that, but I've been hearing a lot about very different senses of culture, power, and influence, where it's less, perhaps less the kind of hub and spoke model, and much more, a very deliberate, different way of operating that isn't the. And then you pinged up the slide that said, if you were just waiting for what happens next or going back, stop, or that McKinsey quote. I thought, well, you kind of answered it, but this is an area I was really keen to hear your thoughts on.
Brilliant. Yeah, it's really nicely put. I think there's a whole reimagining how management and how information works and moves around an organization. I think you're totally right about that. Hybrid is just, there would be lots of different words for what may happen, and distributed or dispersed, I think, is also accurate. But I mean, even just getting into a little bit the philosophical point, which is even that whole idea of information needing to percolate up to a number of decision makers and then percolate down to people who then execute those decisions, that model should and can change. I think we've seen that that's too slow in a crisis. So there's a much more hub and spoke or network teams orientated way of having an organization. Now, I'm not particularly well versed in OD, or there are much better experts on that, but I just think slowly, I think people are going to realize that paradigm shift needs to take place, because the structure of that triangle of an organization just won't work with the speed or the complexity of the challenges that are ahead. So I think you're absolutely right. Finding a way to communicate, and wherever people are, whatever their skills are, how do you engage them in what they need to be doing, and what they can be doing and offering. The gig economy was one way of doing it, and I think that model might continue. The kind of giving tasks to people, but even that will evolve, is my suspicion. Does that raise some of the things that you were discussing, that you were thinking?
I'd say yes, absolutely. It's just really, I have no answers to it. It's just something that I found really thought-provoking before. It's great to hear your perspectives. It's really... I think this thing around being deliberate, rather, as it happened, I said you summed it up with McKinsey quote. The stop waiting and start acting, and it was just one of the dimensions I was really curious about. But thank you.
Yeah.
One of the things that
it's amazing.
Keith commented on earlier was the generational thing of younger people not necessarily having that experience of learning with each other and having that experience with each other. And, in response to that, we've started putting together some kind of training and approach that would feed that a little bit, to give that sense of how do we learn on the job? How do we induct ourselves into an organization? So we're going to need to think laterally and hybridly and creatively, and treat that as something positive and powerful rather than scary and damaging, I think.
A couple of things.
I think one of the things going through my mind when I said that was that I think many people are experiential learners. And when you're in the early stages of your career, so much of what you learn is by being there, by seeing it, by walking with your boss down the corridor after a meeting. All that kind of stuff is suddenly gone.
Yeah.
And it bothers me a lot because, well, personally, it bothers me because I know that's how I learned a lot. And I know that's not how everybody learns, but I do believe that most people do. But secondly, even if we move to a hybrid model, a much more flexible way of working, there's still going to be challenges in providing younger people in their careers with that level of experience. And I think it's one of the other things I posted as a comment. I think it is difficult for senior leaders in particular to put themselves in the shoes of someone who's 25 and desperate to learn when they're sat in the comfort of their Surrey home, in their study, with everything they need around them. You know, life feels fine from there, right? I can do Zoom and all that. Why haven't I done this before? It's very easy to fall into that trap. And I would just offer a lot of caution, I suppose, that, you know, whatever size of company, I think it's really important not to overlook that the lessons we learn early in our career, we take forward with us for many years.
And Keith, if I come in on that as well to add to it, by the way, Keith loves everyone who lives in Surrey, for those of you who are in Surrey now. But I read this a while back, which was every company should have an under 30-year-old on their board. But and whether that's true or not, I think a really lovely idea is that everyone should have a mentor who is under 30. And I think that also can really support, you know, how that, and for that matter, of a completely different perspective, of a completely different understanding. Because David, to your point, I can only give my understanding from a perspective. And I think to be able to move through many different perspectives is the art of being able to see things from a critical standpoint. So yeah, really good.
And who else would like to contribute? I know, Nikki, you had some great things to say about being present. Are you able to unmute and chat a bit more about that? Oh, it's maybe not, maybe difficult. Okay. Anyone else like to contribute something? What's the one question that you're going to wish you had asked before you leave the meeting? You know, when you just leave and you go, I wish I'd asked that.
And it might be a comment.
They're all just dying to have their dinners.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, well, maybe we should just wrap this up now, guys. And
Bring it together.
On behalf of everyone on the webinar and the board at LHRC, a big thank you to Working Voices, to Tom, Julia and Nick. Really appreciate you making the time to run this for us this evening. And a number of you I've noticed in the chat boxes have been asking about the slides and so on. Just to say that the recording, as I mentioned at the beginning, we have recorded this. That will be available in the next couple of days. You can access that through the LHRC site, plus anyone who registered for the webinar will automatically receive it, so all of you will get it anyway. And finally, just from me, on behalf of the board, 2 dates for your diary coming up in February. We've got 2 more webinars booked. One is on February the 11th at the same time, 4:30. Which has the title Surviving and Thriving in the Travel Industry, which my guess is there's probably going to be a lot of emphasis on surviving and less on thriving, given recent announcements. And that's going to be delivered by the personal group. And then on the 24th of February, also at 4:30, a seminar run by Joint Talent called The New War for Talent, you'll recall the War for Talent, which was the original McKinsey work of 20-something years ago. So Joint Talent are going to be running that particular session for us, which is going to be focused much more on hiring in the in this more remote and flexible workplace, which we've just been talking about. So 11th of February, 24th of February, 2 great webinars coming up for you all to enjoy. Hope to see you on there. In the meantime, thanks again, Working Voices, for your time, and for all of you for joining us. Have yourselves a good evening.
Thank you, Keith.